Well, what you've got here right now is the old timers panel. The pictures that you were just looking at, I think the three of us actually remember some of those as briefing charts that we used. I was going to take issue with the fact that this was the 10th anniversary, but I think everybody's made clear that to some of us, certainly the three of us, this is about the 25th anniversary of Space Station. What you're going to get this afternoon are some personal memories and some perspectives, maybe even some insights about Space Station, and from Mac and from Freddie and from myself. My memories of Space Station date back to 1981 when I first joined NASA. President Ronald Reagan, you saw a picture of him with much darker hair than we remember. He had just been elected and inaugurated, and he named James Beggs to be administrator of NASA. To become administrator of NASA, Jim had to go through confirmation hearings in front of our U.S. Congress. And Jim anticipated the fact that the development phase of the space shuttle was finishing up, and he allowed that his personal vision for NASA was that NASA should build a permanently manned orbiting space station. Now, that was just his personal vision. He knew he had to sell that to the administration. He was he was sworn in as NASA administrator in July of 1981. So what happened within NASA, of course, was that space station design concepts and program plans came out of the woodwork. By that fall, just a couple of months later, NASA had organized an internal planning meeting for Space Station. It was held down in New Orleans in November 1981. One of the very important topics that was addressed at that internal planning meeting was international participation in the station. The concept of international cooperation has been an integral part of the space program since the earliest days. There have been cooperative programs in science and applications in the space transportation system that involved the US and Europe and Japan and Canada in very mutually beneficial ways. And so it was really no surprise that as NASA started talking about Space Station, that the scientists and the engineers at Johnson and Marshall and Kennedy at headquarters throughout the agency, that they started talking to their counterparts, their friends actually, about international participation in the station. And these conversations were going on between NASA and ESA, the national space agencies throughout Europe, NRC in Canada, NASDA and ISS in Japan. So all of this was going on. From the perspective of this international audience, I think one of the most significant things that came out of that November '81 internal planning meeting was something that was called the Guidelines for International Participation. Now, many people at NASA, most particularly Jim Beggs and certainly myself, were unambiguous in their belief that the space station could only proceed as an international partnership. And this was for political reasons as well as programmatic reasons. But many others at NASA, suffice it to say, were more cautious about this issue. So the guidelines, they reflected NASA's tradition for international cooperation in its programs, but they also reflected NASA's demand for control in these kinds of programs. Key among those guidelines was a statement that, and I'm going to read the quote here, that space station planning should proceed as if the entire project were to be developed as a wholly U.S. effort. And that's a quote. From within NASA, and probably even more so, more broadly in the administration and from the U.S. Congress, came demands that the space station, that the international elements of the space station not be in the critical path to completion of a fully functional space station. These phrases came to haunt the early planning and the negotiation of the first international agreement, the ones that we here were involved in. There were many other principles related to cooperation that came out of tradition that also were articulated in those guidelines and found their way into the early agreements. Things like no exchange of funds, no technology transfer, and the requirement for clean technical and managerial interfaces. All of those were on the table as of those guidelines. Following that internal NASA meeting, in January '82, there was an international meeting to which all of many of our potential partners were invited to participate in early Phase A planning for the station. The agency at that time made it very clear to all of these potential partners that the station was just a gleam in the agency's eyes. It was not yet an approved program, but the partners were invited to start planning with us under those conditions. So throughout 1982 and into 1983, space agencies in Europe and Japan and Canada worked with NASA, conducting parallel studies and mission requirements and on utilization requirements and mission concepts. We weren't really talking hardware at that time yet because we didn't have an approved program. But one of the things that we realized we were doing was developing rationales for a space station, helping one another to develop the arguments that we all would use when it came time to sell the program within our own countries. Back in Washington, Jim Beggs was having a tough battle within the administration selling the program. This involved what we call an interagency process. It wasn't NASA's decision alone. All of the other agencies who knew how to spell space had a view and an opinion and got a vote on this. The whole interagency process was aimed eventually at getting presidential approval for the station, and only at that time would station be a new initiative for NASA. But the reality was, as many of us knew, that NASA was really standing alone in this battle. None of the other agencies, all for their own reasons, supported NASA, wanted NASA to undertake this program. The biggest reason was what we call in Washington the zero-sum game. What one party gains, the other parties lose. What NASA gets to spend, the other agencies don't have available for their own programs, and this particularly applied to the Defense Department. And no one was sanguine that NASA's prediction that the space station was only going to cost $8 billion was realistic. Imagine that. And to make matters worse, the president's science advisor, Jay Keyworth, was just flat out opposed to the space station. He saw the implications of the station of leading even beyond that apocryphal $8 billion. He called the station the camel's nose under the tent. He thought that this was NASA's first step towards sending humans back to Mars. So at that time, in 1983, Jim Beggs actually had to go on record that nothing was further from NASA's mind. There was another interesting wrinkle that was going on in this interagency battle. As a first line of argument, all the other agencies just opposed the space station. But as a backup line of argument, they opposed international participation. They recognized that if the station was approved over their objections to the program, that having the partners on board would make it harder for them to try to kill the station later. This was a very prescient viewpoint, I think, on the part of the other agencies, given the help that NASA has received over the years from all of the international partners in supporting budgetary commitments for the station in front of our White House and OMB and in front of the U.S. Congress. And for that, I think everybody at NASA thanks you. Well, regardless of the agency's enemies, NASA had one very powerful friend in this process, and that was the president himself. Remember the timing of this. This was the early 1980s. This was the height of the Cold War. We had a president who saw astronauts as heroes and And he saw the space program as a tangible demonstration of American political leadership and technological strength. And it's hard to think now, with Russia as a major partner in the program, that from a political perspective, the station in Washington was seen as a projection of the capabilities of the West vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The next panel is going to talk about the amazing shift in that playing field, but I think it's important for us to recognize, to remember where this thing actually got started. Well, many options papers and many decision documents later, the President formally agreed that NASA's next logical step was indeed a permanently manned space station. The issues of whether a station or not, whether international cooperation or not, all of those were resolved so that the President could announce the space station in his January 1984 State of the Union address. So he directed NASA to build a permanently manned station, and he invited, again, let me get these exact words, he invited America's friends and allies to join the program to strengthen peace and expand freedom for all who share our goals. Again, a little bit of Cold War language there, but that reflected those times. So over the next years, the technical work on designing the program proceeded apace, and some of us were extremely involved in the international negotiations, which established the relationships among all the partners. The first set of MOUs among the US, Europe, Japan, and Canada were eventually signed 4 years later in 1988. The challenges of those negotiations were many. We were working on identifying the elements that would comprise the station from all of the partners. We worked on developing management schemes and decision-making mechanisms that would protect all of the investments that all of the partners had made. We worked on ways to share resources and operations costs in ways that we all felt would be fair and equitable. And we dealt with some pretty sticky legal and policy issues, things like protection of intellectual property, technology transfer, and military use, which was a big and difficult issue, as some of us remember. But back then, I think one of the most difficult issues that we had to face was this underlying incongruity in our task. And that was, how could we accommodate this US objective of demonstrating leadership while at the same time we were trying to create a harmonious partnership, a genuine partnership that would reflect and protect the investments, the contributions, the interests of all of our partners. And I think this is a perfect time to turn over to our partners, because they can tell that part of the story perhaps better than any of us. Freddie, how did Europe go about? I've talked about how the US went about securing approval for this program. How did you all in Europe go about getting approval for the program?
Well, for me, the space station came on the radar screen 1985, out of the blue, actually. I was a delegate at the ministerial conference in Rome, 30 and 31st of January, a cold, drab Rome. But inside the room, things were happening. This was a meeting which was masterminded by Reimar Lust, Director General for ESA, and George Van Rate. And they knew from experience that if you need Europe to get together on something, you need a package deal. They had received the invitation from the President, so Europe was there and was going to answer. Now, to create a package deal in Europe, and at least in the space business, what do you have to do? Well, first, you have to line up the Germans, the French, and the Italians. So the first package was, and very balanced to the last accounting unit, was the space station part, Italy, Germany, and then of course, if you're going to have the French in there, the launchers. Ariane 5 was a very, very important part. Now, then, of course, we also needed to have the Brits in. And they were great fans of Earth observation, of course, and science and so on. So in the space station program, or the Columbus program, entered the polar platforms, gigantic things. And also, of course, lots of small countries like this and that and so on. But it was important also to give a boost to the scientific program. So the scientific program got an increase with 5% per year. That, of course, was also meant to soothe the scientific community, which is a powerful lobby group in Europe. So I was sitting there and hearing all this, my God, what's going on here? And that didn't stop with that. Then comes, we need life sciences and materials research. Microgravity program, boom. Then the applications program of the European Space Agency should also be directed to support the space station or the Columbus effort, data relay satellites. And then a text that was talking about Europe's independent, autonomous capability to operate space infrastructures. That was a tall order. Now, you were referring to the American leadership. And of course, in the statements from the Director General at the time, at Raimar Löst and so on, he had some ominous mentioning saying, we are now going to respond to the invitation, but it would be discourteous for me to say what we're going to respond before we've done it in a written form to the Americans. And then the text was full of this autonomous stuff. And of course, it's true that there were things laid down there which eventually then came up in the IGA discussions and so forth. But one should also realize that 1985 then, it was a watershed. The whole European space scene changed like that. The budgets were doubled. The resources to space was really, people were getting employed, industries were getting ready. Nobody was really ready for this, and it took some time to build this up. So there I was in January. A few months afterwards, I got a telephone call from Raimar Löst, who wanted to see me. And a few months after that, 1st of October, I was director of Space Station and Platforms and preparing myself for my first meeting with NASA and Peggy. That's how we started.
Freddie, how difficult, is this on? Okay. How difficult was, in that kind of fishbowl throughout Europe, how difficult was it to get started on those negotiations that we met each other through?
I think that up till then, the MOU was something that I had been confronted with a long time before. It was a fantastic invention by NASA early on, which meant that NASA could do international programs without really ratification by Congress. So NASA had their own foreign policy, which of course Peggy was part of, and they could do that rather freely, because all these MOUs, they were saying best effort and we will try, and provided that we are getting the resources that we get and so on, and they always got them. But MOUs was total anathema to the legal world of Europe. So when we come to space station, MOU, yeah, agencies and so on can play around with stuff like that. But here we need real agreements. And this meant international government agreements, and that's a whole new machinery that was set up. It was not one ambassador among the 13 European states participating who was not engaged one way or the other in the discussions on the space station. Ministry people. So it was quite difficult to keep the clean lines. But of course, already then we developed our special channels. And luckily, we had people like Jim Zimmerman and Peggy, who called me and told me what really was going on. And that was a great help.
Mac, how come Canada got involved in this program?
Well, there really are two, I think, significant reasons why. One is very political, and I think as we look into the future of where space may go internationally, we shouldn't ever forget that programs of this size, and if we're talking about Moon and Mars, these are very large undertakings at the national level, and they require political support if they're going to get approved. At the time, in 1984, when the invitation came to Canada, we had just elected a new government under Prime Minister Mulroney, who was an Irishman. Ronald Reagan was an Irishman. And so they hit it off very, very well. Similarly, at the same time, Canada was lobbying to become a member of what was then the G7, now the G8, because Canada is a member. And so when President Reagan made space station probably the #1 foreign policy initiative of his early years, our government at the national level wanted to be part of that, to be able to show that Canada was worthy of being part of the G8. So at the very high levels in Canada, you had the same sort of commitment to the program that President Reagan had in the United States. However, in our system of government, it takes more than just the Prime Minister to make things happen. And so there were also, of course, what I call the technical or bureaucratic approaches that needed to be followed. Now here we were in a good position because we had just had the first few missions of the Canadarm on the shuttle, which had raised the Canadian populace understanding and appreciation for the Canadian space program to levels we'd never seen before. It was front page news and first item on the national news at night every time the Canadarm was used for something. Plus we'd also had just had Marc Garneau, our first astronaut, fly. And so space was very much part of the psyche of Canadians. They were very proud of those accomplishments. But we had to translate that excitement into some really hard-nosed reasons, economic reasons, why Canada should participate in the program. Fortunately, we had enough experience on the Canadarm to be able to demonstrate that there were actual economic returns from the fact that we were developing this advanced robotics. It's now being used in sophisticated mining operations, nuclear facilities, now spread into medical operations. And so we think that we have been able to achieve some really substantial economic benefits from our particular participation. And so we were able to marshal those economic arguments as we went through the government decision-making process so that the bean counters, which every government has, could see that there was some benefit to this program other than the fact that Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney sang Irish Eyes Are Smiling together, which they did at a summit in Quebec City. So we had, I think, a perfect alignment in Canada of a political interest, a political rationale, a sound economic and technical reason, and these things all came together, and Canada joined. I'd like to just add one thing. I think it's very important to listen to the history that Peggy went through when we do think about the future of international cooperation. It's not easy to develop this cooperative spirit. But it is absolutely essential if humankind is to achieve what they want to do and what is possible. With the right political will, I think we're able to do enormous things. The space station has proven that. And I think the fact that the United States took the lead, made this a world political event, is the reason the space station exists today.
In retrospect, Mac, what do you think about those the agreements we negotiated? Have they worked for Canada?
You know, I like to. It's part of the. It was interesting to hear your negotiating position because, of course, we didn't have that in those days, and we had to guess what you were doing, but we understood what you were doing, and I think what has happened. Those of us who've been around long enough, we've seen. I would say we've rounded off NASA's corners. It was an organization, you know, it had just come off the Apollo program and the shuttle program, world-class events, obviously, and we're used to doing things of their own. And to have international partners come in and desire a true partnership, one where we all had an equal say in what goes on, where we were able to control our own destiny in this partnership, this was something new for NASA. And I think over the 4 years of our negotiations, the real sticking points occurred as we tried to round off NASA's corners and get them to budge on a few things. And I know Peggy had to go back many, many times to the authorities in the United States to really carry the message that if they wanted international participation, it had to be on the basis of a true partnership. And so that's one of the things I think these agreements have been able to accomplish. We have shown through these agreements, which have flywheeled through tremendous political events. Just think about what's happened since the Cold War era where this thing started to where we are now. Horrendous changes in the political world. Our former enemies are now our allies. Governments have changed everywhere. The capacities of our individual nations and space agencies have changed. But the agreements that were negotiated in 84, 88 have been able to flywheel through all of those changes and keep the program on track. So I think probably, to me anyways, the strongest legacy of the space station era will be the fact that we were able to design a management system, a cooperative environment that allowed 16 now nations of the world to build equipment, fly it into space, have it work together, and then live and work in space as a cooperative team. That had never before been done, and it was all done under these MOUs and IGAs that were negotiated in that time frame. So I think that the fundamental legacy of Space Station is we have built the political and management basis for future international cooperation as we explore the universe.
Thank you, Mac. Freddie, what's your perspective on that? How have those agreements held up as a basis for cooperation between Europe and the U.S. in the context of the partnership?
I agree with what Mac said, but I think also that a proof of how smartly crafted all the agreements were was that we, in fact, over this time, never have had any major conflict because we discussed a lot. Now, if we cannot agree on that, what is happening then? And if they cannot agree on that, what is happening then? And it was systems like that. Now, in an engineering project like Space Station, daily you have to take decisions. Daily you have to agree. And of course, it was the back of, at least my mind, that any engineer on the floor who realizes the process that he's going to start, if he cannot agree with these guys, he'll find a solution. And they have. Everything was solved by the project guys and the engineers. Grosso modo.
Mac, did you have anything else you wanted to add about the process? Or?
And just to the process itself, we talked about all the sort of things that are in the IGA and MOUs, and we talk about the management process. But I think, in addition to that, the legal processes that we were able to develop. I often give talks to people about the space station program, and those of you who are old enough will remember a game called Clue. And I often refer to, well, they say, what sort of legal problems did you have to solve? I said, well, think about the game Clue, you see. If the Japanese astronaut hits an American astronaut over the head in the European module using the Canadian arm, whose laws apply? And, you know, the legal regime for solving those things has been put in place. So this is why I think the legacy of the program really is, and I agree with Freddie, that's what I was saying when I said the program has flywheeled through many, many changes, but the basic management program, the IGA MOU, has set the basis. And I think as we go forward, there are things, you know, that people will want to change, and I have no doubt about that, but I think people should look very closely at the MOU-IGA process as they decide about the future international cooperation in space, because I think it really has accomplished what it set out to do.
And Freddie, do you have any final words about the process?
It was a crazy process, that's for sure, to get there. And there were a few outstanding people that managed to keep that on the road, and I must say you were one of them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The trust factor that was mentioned earlier is key. We all had our negotiating strategies and our negotiating objectives, but these had to be bent over time as we understood the real issues on the other side. And Peggy was a master at letting us know where she had room to maneuver and where she didn't. And so as a result, you know, we spent 4 years basically living in Washington, Paris, sometimes in Tokyo and Ottawa, designing these things, and but without a desire to make it happen and someone who knows how to make their own system work well, this would never happen. So I think we really do owe a lot of credit to Peggy and her skills and her ability to make the U.S. system respond to this horrendous international pressure for a true partnership.
Well, I don't think it was just, this isn't about me, even if I am the moderator, but thank you very much for those compliments, and I want to share them. We had Europe, Japan, which is not represented here in this panel, will be represented in the next one, of course, and it was a hard job for all of us to project during the negotiations what we were allowed to say at that point in time, and then have to turn 180 degrees and go back home and tell our home agency what was going to fly and what wasn't. So I think all of us had these feelings of schizophrenia during those 4 or 5 years, knowing that we really had to do that representation both ways. I used to joke that I was only 27 years old, and look what these negotiations had done to me. But it may have been the most challenging thing I ever did in my career. I know it was certainly the most rewarding, and I think one of the agreements got signed, and we all think that they've worked, and so that's good testimony to the process. But I think another testament to the process is the fact that we're all still friends. So. Okay, technically our half hour is up. I don't know.
Yes.
Where did that voice come from?
Cuckoo. I was listening very carefully to what you're saying. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
I think this is the bottom. We can really